Ethan Caldwell stepped into the courtroom. His posture straight, but his hands clenched at his sides. The old suit he wore was slightly wrinkled, his tie a little off-center, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He wasn't a lawyer, he had never set foot in a law school, but today he was fighting for something bigger than himself. Across the room, Vincent Harrington, a corporate attorney with an impeccable track record, barely spared him a glance. Vincent adjusted his cufflinks, whispered something to his assistant, and let out a smirk as if the case was already won. Ethan could hear the murmurs from the gallery, the quiet chuckles from the other attorneys, but he ignored them. He had been underestimated before, this wasn't new. Judge Malcolm Greaves peered down at Ethan from his bench, his expression unreadable. He tapped his gavel lightly, then let out a slow breath. "Mr. Caldwell, you are representing yourself?" His tone was laced with mild amusement, as if he had already decided how this was going to end. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." A scoff came from Vincent's side of the courtroom, but Ethan refused to be rattled. He knew what they thought: a man with no legal training had no business standing here. Judge Greaves sighed, flipping through his files before glancing back at Ethan. "This is a foreclosure dispute." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. My grandmother's home." Greaves barely looked up. "And you believe you can argue this case against Mr. Harrington?" Ethan straightened his shoulders. "I don't believe, Your Honor." "I know." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom, some amused, some intrigued. Even Vincent raised an eyebrow, the smirk on his face fading slightly. "Very well," Judge Greaves muttered, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Harrington, you may proceed with your opening statement." Vincent rose smoothly, adjusting his expensive suit as he stepped forward. His voice was like silk, calm, collected, and brimming with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." He gestured toward Ethan without even looking at him. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was legally acquired by my client through standard foreclosure proceedings." He paused, glancing at the jury as if they were already in agreement. "The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotions, this is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations." He let the words settle before adding, "And unfortunately, Mr. Caldwell did not meet those obligations." He clasped his hands together and gave a small, calculated smile before returning to his seat. The confidence radiating off him was suffocating, but Ethan didn't let it shake him. He had expected this. Taking a deep breath, he stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he started, voice steady. "Mr. Harrington is right about one thing: the law is clear." He turned, locking eyes with Vincent. "The question is, did his client actually follow it?" A flicker of irritation crossed Vincent's face. Ethan continued, "I've spent the last 6 months studying every loophole, every case, every statute that corporations like his use to steal homes from families." He reached into his folder and pulled out a document. "And I found something." Judge Greaves arched an eyebrow, his skepticism shifting into curiosity. "Something?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. And it changes everything." Vincent let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "This should be good." Ethan ignored him and turned to the judge. "Before I present my argument, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery. I have reason to believe the plaintiff is withholding key documents." The shift in the room was immediate. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening. "Withholding what, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan locked eyes with Vincent. "Evidence of fraud." Silence. The weight of the accusation was palpable, pressing down on every person in the courtroom. Vincent's smirk disappeared, his jaw tightening as he shot a glance at his assistant. Judge Greaves leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the bench. "Fraud, Mr. Caldwell?" His tone was skeptical, but beneath it, there was something else: interest. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents, and if granted full discovery, I can prove it." Vincent let out an exasperated sigh, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable." The judge turned to him. "Mr. Harrington, does your client have the original signed mortgage documents?" Vincent hesitated barely a second, but long enough for Ethan to see it. The hesitation was all he needed. Ethan leaned in. "Because if they do, Your Honor, I'd like to compare them with the ones on file." Judge Greaves nodded. "Very well. I'll grant discovery. Mr. Harrington, your client will submit the original mortgage documents by the end of the day." Vincent's jaw clenched, but he forced a polite nod. "Understood, Your Honor." Ethan exhaled slowly, a small victory already taking shape. He wasn't here to stall. He wasn't here to plead for sympathy. He was here to expose the truth, and they had no idea what was coming next. Vincent Harrington sat stiffly at his table, his fingers tapping against the polished wood in agitation. This was not how things were supposed to go. The case was supposed to be quick routine. Even. Yet now the judge had granted discovery and Ethan Caldwell was staring at him like a man who had already won. Vincent forced a tight smile and turned toward the judge. Your Honor, we will of course comply. However, I must object to the insinuation that my client has engaged in fraudulent activity. His voice was measured, but there was a hint of unease beneath it. Judge Greaves barely spared him a glance. Noted, Mr. Harrington. But if there's nothing to hide, I see no reason why the document shouldn't be provided. The words landed like a gavel strike, and Vincent knew he had no choice. Ethan remained calm on the outside, but inside his pulse raced. This was his chance, the opening he needed. If he was right about the documents being forged, then this entire case would collapse. The next morning, Vincent's team submitted the requested paperwork, and Ethan pored over every page, cross-referencing it with the copies he had. And then, after hours of examining signatures, dates, and small discrepancies, he found it. The inconsistency he had suspected from the beginning. His breath caught as he stared at the two mortgage agreements, one from the initial filing and another from a later modification. The signatures were different. Not slightly different, completely different. Back in the courtroom, Ethan stood before the judge, holding up the two documents. Your Honor, these are the original mortgage records submitted by the plaintiff, compared with the modified agreement that was used to justify foreclosure. He took a deep breath and turned toward the jury. And if you look closely, you'll see that the signatures don't match. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a slow building tension crackling in the air. Judge Greaves leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he scanned the papers. Mr. Harrington, he said slowly. Explain this. Vincent cleared his throat, standing. Your Honor's signature is slightly over time. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. A difference in pressure angle or even just someone's mood can cause minor variations. Ethan didn't even look at him. That might be true if these signatures were years apart. He pointed to the dates on the documents. But these were signed just 3 months apart. And more importantly, he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle over the courtroom. The second document was signed the day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke. A collective gasp filled the room. Even Judge Greaves sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Vincent's expression darkened, but he quickly recovered, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, the burden of proof still rests on Mr. Caldwell. He has no evidence that my client knowingly submitted false documentation. Ethan let the silence linger for a moment before he pulled out another document and handed it to the bailiff. Then let's talk about this. The judge took the paper and read it carefully. What am I looking at, Mr. Caldwell? Ethan's voice was calm, controlled. That's a record of the notary public who supposedly authenticated the second mortgage agreement. He turned, his eyes locking onto Vincent, and I took the liberty of tracking her down. The courtroom stilled. Vincent stiffened. That's irrelevant. Judge Greaves glanced at him. I'll be the judge of that. He turned to Ethan. Go on. Ethan stepped forward. Her name is Linda Myers, and she agreed to testify today. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. Ethan didn't look away from Vincent, watching the man's jaw tighten, his fingers curling into fists. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman in her late 50s stepped inside, looking uneasy but determined. She walked toward the witness stand, adjusting her glasses as she took a seat. Judge Greaves looked at her. Ms. Myers, please state your name and profession for the record. She cleared her throat. Linda Myers, I'm a licensed notary public. Ethan stepped closer. Mims, Myers, do you recall notarizing a mortgage modification document for the property at 218 West Hollow Street? She hesitated, glancing at Vincent, then back at Ethan. Yes, I do. Ethan's pulse quickened. Were you present when the document was signed? Silence. Then, a whisper. No. The reaction from the courtroom was immediate gasps, whispers, stunned faces. Judge Greaves narrowed his eyes. Ms. Myers, can you clarify what you mean by that? Linda swallowed hard. I was given the document by a bank representative. They told me it had already been signed. I just stamped it. Vincent shot to his feet. Objection. This is hearsay. Judge Greaves didn't even look at him. Overruled. Ethan turned back to Linda, his voice soft but firm. Ms. Myers, are you saying that you notarized the document without witnessing the signature? She nodded slowly, her face pale. Yes. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Ethan exhaled. Your Honor, this confirms what I've been saying. The foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on a fraudulent signature one that was notarized illegally. He turned toward the jury, his voice steady, which means the entire foreclosure process was invalid from the start. Judge Greaves took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he turned to Vincent. Mr. Harrington, does your client have a response? Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then, in a controlled but clipped voice, he said, Your Honor, I request a recess. The judge studied him. Denied. He turned back to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, do you have anything else to submit? Ethan nodded and handed one last document to the bailiff. Yes, Your Honor. This is a list of foreclosure cases handled by the same bank over the past 5 years. And guess what? My grandmother's case isn't the only one with a questionable signature. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Even the jury, who had been mostly quiet observers, leaned forward with keen interest. Judge Greaves skimmed the document, his expression growing darker by the second. Mr. Harrington, he said, his voice dangerously low. If what I'm looking at is accurate, your client may have more to answer for than just this one case. Vincent didn't respond. His face was pale, his hands balled into fists. He had lost control of the case, and he knew it. Judge Greaves set the document down and exhaled slowly. This changes everything. Ethan stood tall, his heart pounding. He had exposed the fraud, now it was only a matter of justice being served. Vincent Harrington was out of moves, and he knew it. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by the rigid stillness of a man trying to salvage a sinking case. Judge Greaves scanned the documents one more time before looking back up, his eyes locked onto Vincent. Mr. Harrington, I'll ask again, does your client have a response to these allegations? The room was so silent that even the faint scratching of the stenographer's pen sounded deafening. Vincent adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and forced a smile. Your Honor, we request time to thoroughly review these claims before making any formal statements. The judge's eyes narrowed, unimpressed. Mr. Harrington, do you take me for a fool? Your client has been engaging in questionable foreclosure practices for years, and you're only now concerned about thoroughly reviewing the documents. Ethan Caldwell remained silent, watching, waiting. He had learned a long time ago that in moments like these, the most powerful move was often to say nothing at all. The weight of evidence had already done the talking for him. Vincent glanced toward his client, a high-ranking bank executive sitting stiffly in the front row. The man's face had gone from smug indifference to something dangerously close to panic. If this fraud was exposed in court, it wouldn't just be a lost case, it would be a scandal, one that could destroy careers, maybe even lead to criminal charges. Your Honor, Vincent finally said, his voice strained, we request an immediate settlement discussion. A ripple of whispers swept through the gallery. The jury exchanged glances. Even the court reporter looked up, momentarily surprised. Judge Greaves exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Mr. Harrington, after what has been presented in this courtroom today, I'm not inclined to allow your client to simply write a check and make this disappear. His gavel tapped against the bench. This case will proceed to a final ruling. Ethan's stomach tightened. This was it. The moment he had fought for. The moment his grandmother deserved. Vincent clenched his jaw, realizing there was no way out. The judge turned to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, do you have any final statements before I make my ruling? Ethan stepped forward, glancing briefly at the jury before turning his attention to the judge. Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. My grandmother's home was stolen through fraudulent means. But she's not the only victim. This bank has done this to countless families, hoping no one would notice, hoping no one would fight back. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. What we noticed. And we fought back. And now I'm asking this court to do what's right. Judge Greaves studied him for a long moment, then turned to Vincent. Mr. Harrington, do you wish to say anything else? Vincent hesitated, but when he spoke, his voice was flat. No, Your Honor. The judge sat back, taking one final breath before delivering his verdict. This court finds the foreclosure against the defendant to be invalid. The property is to be immediately returned to its rightful owner. Furthermore, I am ordering an independent investigation into the plaintiff's foreclosure practices. If evidence of further fraud is found, criminal charges will be pursued. A shockwave of energy erupted in the courtroom. The gallery murmured in disbelief. The jury nodded among themselves, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and approval. Vincent sank into his seat, defeated. Ethan turned toward the jury, his chest rising with a deep breath. It was over. They had won. Outside the courthouse, Ethan stepped into the afternoon light, feeling the weight of the battle slowly lift from his shoulders. The air felt different, cleaner, freer. Reporters had gathered near the steps, waiting, their cameras rolling. He could hear snippets of their coverage already. A landmark case against fraudulent foreclosures. A stunning victory for homeowners everywhere. A single man takes on a corporate giant and wins. But Ethan didn't care about the headlines. He cared about one thing: his grandmother's home was safe. As he reached the bottom of the steps, he heard someone call out behind him. Caldwell. Ethan turned to see Judge Greaves standing at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets. You ever think about law school? The older man's voice was gruff but held an undeniable note of respect. Ethan let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Not really. Greaves smirked. Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for exposing the truth. Then, with a small nod, the judge turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. Ethan stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Law school? The idea had never crossed his mind before. But as he looked around at the reporters, at the people who had gathered to watch justice being served, he realized something. This fight wasn't just about his grandmother. This was about something bigger. Because power doesn't belong to those who can afford it. It belongs to those who refuse to back down. Life has a way of making us feel small, of convincing us that power belongs only to the wealthy, the connected, and those who have spent years mastering the system. But Ethan Caldwell's story proves otherwise. Power doesn't come from money, it comes from courage. It comes from standing up when no one believes in you, from refusing to accept defeat, and from fighting even when the odds are stacked against you. Ethan wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a corporate giant. He was just a man who refused to let his grandmother's home be stolen. And in doing so, he didn't just win back her house, he exposed the truth, held the corrupt accountable, and reminded the world that justice still matters. The lesson here is clear. Never let anyone tell you that you don't have a voice. If something is worth fighting for, then fight, even if they underestimate you, especially if they underestimate you. Because when you refuse to back down, you don't just change your own life, you inspire others to stand up to. The underestimated always have the most to prove. And when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything.